Who was that? Lisa asked, her eyes staring intently at me as I sat in a small cafe, trying to comprehend the collision of two completely different worlds that had just met. Her charming features, long dark hair falling over her tanned skin and high cheekbones, expressed astonishment. I paused, maintaining eye contact, and took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. It was Kate, I replied. Lisa tilted her head, her eyebrows slightly raised in confusion as she continued to stare at me, trying to make sense of it. And so, finally, it came to her, and understanding appeared in her eyes. So it's the same Kate? She asked in disbelief, trying to connect what she saw with what she had heard before. Lisa, dear, I began softly, we've been together for a long time. I haven't seen her in 5 or 6 years, maybe more, I explained. I just didn't know that she. Lisa began, but her words were cut off. I see, I added gently, I guess I should tell you the whole story. Lisa sat across from me without looking away, and with a slight nod made it clear that she was ready to listen. Aside from one church trip to Mexico 9 years ago, I had never ventured far from my rural home until entering my freshman year at Taft University. My world was small, limited by the farm families in our tiny town of Benton. My parents, deeply religious, raised me in this environment, which contributed to my naivety. They were cautiously happy that I had received an agricultural scholarship at Taft, but I sensed their apprehension about my departure. Suddenly I found myself in a dormitory where hundreds of other students lived. My roommate, Jake from Chicago, seemed a little disappointed at first to be placed with a provincial boy. But over time we became friends. The stories my dorm roommates told shocked me. In high school, all I did was hold hands and kiss. And now I heard wild stories about romantic adventures that made me doubt their veracity. Another surprise was that the boys' and girls' dorms were in the same building, just on different floors. One day, when I was borrowing a book from a girl in my English class, I went upstairs and saw 2 girls coming out of the shower room, wrapped only in small towels. I couldn't take my eyes off them. They noticed this, and one whispered something to the other, causing laughter. "Hey Tom," they called to me, and here they playfully exposed their bodies before quickly covering up again, laughing and walking away. I was completely confused because I had very little experience with women. Their joke left an imprint in my memory. To say I was naive and inexperienced would be an understatement. Over time, my roommates noticed this and started making fun of me all the time. Despite my innocence, I was a typical 19-year-old trying to cope with university life and the same temptations that my peers faced. Growing up in a deeply religious environment, I believed that sex was something shameful and should only be for marriage, with the sole purpose of having children. This new knowledge about relationships seemed completely different to what I had been taught. The temptations of intimacy defied my religious upbringing, and by the time I was a third year at Taft University, I was still chaste. This is not to say that I had absolutely no experience up to that point. I have had one brief intimate episode and a few other close moments in my past, but nothing serious. There were lots of parties at Taft on the weekends, and my friends, especially Jake and the other guys from the dorm, were always trying to get me involved. I was focused on my studies, brought up in a hardworking family, so I only attended such events occasionally, maybe once or twice a month. I was interested in agricultural science, but I did not aspire to follow in the footsteps of my family in farming. Instead I dreamed of improving existing farming methods. The idea of studying abroad has always appealed to me, probably because my upbringing was too limited and I wanted to discover more. One spring evening when I was in my third year, Jake talked me into going with him to a party held in a large field near the stadium. Red and white tents, the colors of our university, filled the square, and for $10 we could drink cheap beer. By then, I was somewhat used to the party life, although my inner struggle with lack of experience was still showing. I knew I would end up in a serious relationship sooner or later, but my upbringing constantly reminded me of moral limitations, and it made me question whether I should give in to temptation so easily. Standing in the crowd, I noticed that my friends had left. It was then that I met Leela for the first time. A drunk guy pushed me and my drink spilled on her. "Thanks, really great," she said with irritation as the beer spilled over her shoulder and down her shirt. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," I muttered, reaching for a tissue to help her dry herself. As I started to wipe her shirt, I suddenly realized how close my hand was to her body. I instantly froze and then clumsily handed her the napkin. She took it, but at the same time she did not let go of my hand. Her face changed from angry to playful. "Aren't you going to finish the job?" she joked, her voice light-hearted. Well. I mumbled, feeling my face burn with embarrassment. She laughed and said, "Most guys would jump at any chance to get closer." I wanted to say something, but I couldn't find the words. "I guess we should introduce ourselves before we get too close," she added with a smile. "I'm Lila Brown." She held out her hand and I finally said, "Hi, I'm Matt Thomas." "Nice to meet you, Matt," she said, not letting go of my hand. "Now let's find me a drink I can drink instead of carrying around." She took me to the kegs and I spent the rest of the evening chatting with her. I learned that she is a sophomore at Taft studying business and living off campus in a family apartment. She was attractive, if a little different from the girls I'd dated before, but still captivating with her blonde hair and petite frame that was about a foot shorter than my 6 feet 2 inches height. She had a slim, athletic build. As the evening progressed, her playful mannerisms and inviting smile drew my attention more and more. At the end of the party, she asked if I wanted to walk her home. Her apartment was above a restaurant called Papaya, which I had heard of but had never been to. This establishment was located on a corner, in the heart of the city, next to the campus, and included a small cafe in the front and a bar with a lively atmosphere in the back. "My brother owns this building," Lila mentioned, and I was amazed. We went up the back stairs to her apartment. "I don't have a neighbor right now," she said, and I felt a little nervous. Brief meetings in my dorm felt like something completely different in this more private environment. Entering her apartment, I hesitated at the threshold, but Lila, still holding my hand, gently pulled me inside. "Maybe we can sit on the sofa?" Lila suggested, leading me to a comfortable place. We settled in, sitting so close that our faces almost touched. We continued to talk and I felt it was time to make a move. I leaned down and kissed her, and she gladly responded, deepening the kiss. After a few minutes, she stepped aside. "I'll be right back," she said, and I considered for a moment whether I should go, feeling that we had come far enough for a first meeting. But when she returned, she was wearing only thong panties, completely baring her upper body. "I guess I should wash my clothes after you doused me in beer," she joked, her playful smile seeming to encourage me to stay. Leela put her arms around me and I felt my morals start to shake. We started to explore each other and she playfully started fiddling with my jeans. I soon lost control of the situation, completely absorbed in the moment. We moved on to her bed and I was filled with mixed feelings of excitement and anxiety. Our first experience was amazing. I wasn't ready and quickly realized that my strength was gone before we could really enjoy the moment. "You're a real enthusiast," Lila laughed. "Next time we'll take it slower." When she came back from the bathroom with a towel, a feeling of embarrassment washed over me, but Leela didn't seem to care. She helped me clean up and assured me that we would still have a chance to do everything again. Emboldened by her words, I started making love with her again, and that's when I lost my virginity. As I lay there afterwards, I could feel my thoughts swarming in my head. Have I gone too far? What is between us now? Does she like me or was it just a brief encounter? I was hoping for something more. Lila felt warm and gentle as she snuggled up to me, and despite all my doubts, I felt a certain peace. She hummed softly, almost like a purring cat, and it calmed me down. But soon she got up and went to the bathroom, and I wondered again if it was time for me to leave. When she came back and asked where I was going, I stumbled, not knowing what to say. "Don't you want to stay?" she asked, wrapping her arms around me and sitting on my lap. I couldn't decide. I wanted to stay, but my inner moral conflict still persisted. And most importantly, I had no experience in such relationships. Still, I decided to stay and we spent the whole weekend together. After that, I started seeing Lila often, usually at her house. Now that my virginity was a thing of the past, my former doubts became less important. I was attracted to her and it was obvious that she felt the same way. Although intimacy occupied a large part of our time, we did not limit ourselves to it. We went to restaurants, participated in various university activities, studied for exams together and did everything that couples usually do. During the first few weeks of my relationship with Lila, I felt that there was more than just attraction between us. I started to really care about her. My roommates noticed that I was less visible, and I explained to them that I was spending a lot of time with a special girl. "Who is she?" Jake asked one evening as we all sat in our apartment. I told them her name was Lila and that she was a sophomore at Taft. I also remembered how we met a few weeks ago at an all-university party. "Is that the girl with snow-white hair?" asked one of my roommates. "Hold on," Jake interjected, "is that her brother who owns Papayas?" I admitted that I didn't know for sure, as I hadn't met her brother yet, but it seemed likely since she mentioned that her family owned the building where her apartment was, and Papaya was in the same complex. Later, after all the other roommates had left, Jake approached me with a serious look on his face. "Listen, I'm glad you got a new girlfriend. You deserve a good man, but be careful," he advised. "Careful about what?" I asked in surprise. Sometimes feelings and physical attraction can be confused, especially with the first serious girl. Just take your time and keep your eyes open. I appreciated his concern, but I wasn't too worried about it at the time. Much later I regretted not paying more attention to his words. Later, I met Lila's brother at Papaya. "So you're the new guy in my sister's life," he said, shaking my hand tightly. They were completely different in appearance. Lila is slender and petite, while her brother Jared was large and made a much more formidable impression. I would estimate his height to be around 6 feet 3 inches and he was considerably heavier than me, but well built. He had similar features to Lila, but a more serious look. "Sit down," Jared said, motioning to an empty table. "Order a drink." "I only want water with ice," I replied. "No, you need something stronger," he insisted, summoning the bartender. I noticed a man at a table in the corner going through some documents. He had a rough appearance, dark skin, a shaved head, and tattoos that went up to his neck. Jared revealed that he owned the building but did not run the bar or cafe, nodding in the direction of the tattooed man. "Armin manages the restaurant. I'm just a landlord here. You should come here in the evening when it's full of people, lots of fun and action," he added. Maybe I will, I thought, although it wasn't exactly my style. Later, when Lila and I were alone, she revealed that her brother was sometimes unpredictable and had a few run-ins with the law. She shared that he had inherited the property from their mother's third husband who had passed away. Jared was very protective of her, and I appreciated that, even though he and I were completely different. As our relationship grew stronger, I began to notice how different we were in our upbringing and outlook. Deep down, I held strong morals, thanks to my disciplined upbringing, while Lila grew up without a biological father and with multiple stepfathers. I felt that Lila had experienced things that she hadn't told me yet, and even though we disagreed at times, we learned to respect our differences. Weeks turned into months and soon the semester came to an end. I spent the summer on an internship in the agricultural department of the university, while Lila stayed in her apartment and worked at Papaya. She usually worked in the cafe during the day, but sometimes she would take shifts at the bar. We almost lived together. On those evenings when she was working, I would go to the bar and wait for her. The regulars of the bar were far from the best variety. I noticed a certain cheapness in the girls, and a predatory look in the men. Lila's brother, Jared, often sat at the back table with Armand, the tattooed bartender. Jared was always friendly, but something about him made me feel uncomfortable and I could never fully relax in his presence. What annoyed me even more was how some of the customers treated Leela: hugs around the waist when she took orders, friendly pats on the back, or overly familiar hugs. I thought it was too frivolous for a girl who was in a relationship. When I mentioned this to Lily, she just shrugged. "It's just part of bartending," she answered nonchalantly, and her indifference to something that was important to me made me uneasy. I understood that sooner or later we would have to talk about it seriously. Another problem this summer was that I missed the application deadlines for a university study abroad program. I realized that my relationship with Leela took away from my motivation to apply. In retrospect, I realized that sometimes I had to sacrifice my personal desires for the sake of a relationship, but I wasn't comfortable with that. I really wanted to study abroad, and now, starting my last year, this opportunity has slipped away from under my nose. Despite all these reflections, our relationship with Lila remained stable and comfortable. She took fewer courses that year and rarely spent time on homework, while my senior year was critical to my education. I was busy with research work and regular classes. Lila met my family on a trip to Benton at the end of the summer. It was like watching two very different worlds collide. She was bright, stylish, with hair bleached a shade of blonde and makeup that contrasted sharply with the simplicity of my family, who wore practical, unadorned clothes. Despite this, my family was warm and hospitable to her. I felt that Lila appreciated certain aspects of our simpler lifestyle, noting the pluses of farm life. Although she never hinted at moving to Benton, I felt like she got a bigger picture of that lifestyle after meeting my folks. Afterwards, I reflected on my desire for her to see that there is more to life than just surface value. I wanted to help her find balance in her spontaneous life, while she opened new horizons for me in a more exciting world. Our intimate moments became even deeper, and we spent a significant part of the time in her bed in the apartment above Papaya. After my low-key previous relationship, it felt like I was trying to make up for lost time. Sometimes when we fought, Leela would use proximity to reconnect, and it always worked, making any problem seem secondary. However, I began to realize that we often avoided really discussing our differences. During winter break, I came home to a holiday filled with joy, holiday decorations, music, and delicious food. It was also a time of spiritual uplift, when we went to church services and experienced the true meaning of the holidays. One day my father asked, a little awkwardly, if I was still seeing Leela. "Yes," I replied. We walked in silence for a few minutes, as if he was digesting new information about my life. "Look, son," he said seriously, "I understand that as a young man you have your desires and Leela is an attractive girl, but getting close to marriage can lead to complications." I tried to change the subject. "Dad," I started, but he continued. "Just listen to me. If you are serious about this girl, I would like you to consider a serious commitment like marriage. You are almost out of university and your adult life is about to begin. We raised you to always do your best and make the right decisions. Part of my role as a parent is to share the wisdom I've accumulated over the years." He put his arm around my shoulders as we walked. "It's your life and you make your own decisions, but I want you to think carefully about every step you take. Make sure you're going in the right direction." As we walked down that country road, I pondered his words. Why don't I marry Leela? She brought me more joy and happiness than I have ever felt. Yes, we had our differences, but I told myself that this could make our bond even stronger. A few days later, as I was about to return to Taft, I hugged everyone goodbye, exchanging warm words before leaving. On the way back, I kept thinking about the conversation with my dad. With these thoughts in mind, I entered the winter semester at Taft. I was advised to apply for a postgraduate research position at the university, a paid job that would allow me to continue doing what I loved. One evening, Lila and I were sitting in her apartment discussing my future. "What are your plans after graduation?" I asked. "I haven't decided yet," she answered. "I wouldn't mind moving somewhere warm, maybe California or Florida. This thought confused me. And what if she decides to go? My life was here, especially if I accepted the offer of a research position. In the weeks that followed, I wondered what life would be like without Leela, and I realized that I didn't want that. Her presence and my father's advice led me to the conclusion that I wanted to marry her. I convinced myself that we would be able to resolve any of our differences in marriage. I thought of my parents and the strong union I envisioned for Lila and me. A few weeks later, over dinner at a small cafe in town, I said, "Lila, you've made me so happy this year. You shared your life with me and I want to be with you forever." I pulled out a box with a ring from my pocket. "Lila, will you marry me?" She looked at me and I saw uncertainty in her eyes as she held the box without opening it. "Do you want to marry me?" she asked, still surprised. "Yes," I replied firmly, looking her intently in the eyes. Finally, she opened the box and put the ring on her finger. A wave of different emotions covered her face. "Are you sure?" she asked again. I nodded, not taking my eyes off her. After taking a deep breath and looking at the ring, she smiled and replied, "Why not?" On the one hand, I was happy that she agreed. But on the other hand, her ease in making a decision surprised me a little. But, in the end, she said yes. As part of our preparations for the wedding, we had to deal with legal issues. We didn't draw up a prenuptial agreement, but we made simple wills and bought small insurance policies to provide for Leela's future and possible children. Over the next few months, the main topic of our conversations became wedding planning. Somewhere in the middle of the winter semester, I noticed that Lila had dropped out. When I asked her about it, she said she would enroll again in the fall. It bothered me, but I decided not to broach the subject. Our families also created some challenges. My family was religious and hardworking, while Lila's family had a more relaxed lifestyle, where alcohol and even drugs were common. Our wedding was supposed to take place in a local church, but the celebration was planned to be held at Papaya, which symbolized the cultural differences between our families. I decided not to focus too much on these contrasts and just enjoy the event, which went surprisingly smoothly. My family seemed a little surprised by the fun atmosphere at Papaya, but no one criticized the social diversity. In the middle of the celebration, I was talking to my mom. "Lila's family is pretty colorful," she remarked without a hint of judgment. I hugged her and said, "That's for sure." I talked to Jared later. Our relationship with Lila's brother had developed somewhat, but I still felt wary around him. He had a domineering presence, as if he was constantly trying to assert his authority. Although he never directly confronted me, I couldn't shake the feeling of mistrust. But at the same time, he worried about Lila and was very protective of her, which I appreciated. "Congratulations, Matt," Jared said, hugging me so tightly I nearly lost my breath. "Thank you, Jared. I love your sister and I want to do everything to make her happy," I said sincerely. He looked at me, nodded, as if assessing the truth of my words. Placing a heavy hand on my shoulder, he added, "She never had a real father. I take this role upon myself. So take good care of her, got it?" His voice grew more serious and he gave the final hug extra weight before pulling away. That I stood still, considering Jared's words, which sounded almost like a warning. At first, family life was not very different from what it was before the wedding. We continued to live in Lila's apartment above Papaya, and the low rent allowed me to save money for a house or land. I expected things to change with marriage, but in reality, things were the same, at least for a while. I insisted that Leela go back to university in the fall, and she agreed, albeit without much enthusiasm. I tried to bring more order to her life, encouraging her to study more and drink less, even offering to go to church together. At first she took it in good humor, often joking, "Yes, Dad," and we both laughed. However, the longer we were married, the more these light reminders began to sound like reproaches. Our different perspectives on life, which I had hoped would make us more multifaceted, began to create an invisible chasm between us. I was increasingly worried about how much time Lila spent at Papaya. She still worked there part-time, both in the coffee shop and sometimes at night at the bar. The bar atmosphere was often too relaxed, sometimes even beyond the bounds of propriety. The overly friendly customers continued to bother me, but what bothered me even more was that Lila sometimes stayed there even when she wasn't working. As our family problems escalated, so did my work. My research in college focused on improving agricultural productivity, particularly through the development of hybrid crops that could improve soils. With the progress of the research and the positive preliminary results, it became clear that I needed to be on site regularly. The farm was more than 200 miles away, about a 3-hour drive. On the territory there was a small hut with basic conditions, but without unnecessary amenities. I remember coming home excited that my project was moving forward and sharing it with Leela. It can have a huge impact on productivity, I explained. If we increase the harvest by 20%, it will seriously affect the food supply. Sounds good, she replied, not taking her eyes off her phone. Obviously, she was not interested in my admiration. Lila, I changed my tone, it's important to me. I want you to share my interests. She looked up, smiled and replied, Matt, I'm happy for you. It's just that sometimes I don't quite understand all these details. I nodded, realizing that agricultural studies might seem dry, but I still believed that couples should be involved in each other's lives. I'll be at Blackstock Farm 3 days a week from next month, I added. So you will spend the night there, she asked. I confirmed that it was too far to drive back every night, but suggested that she come if there was time in her schedule. Lila did not answer. She just stared at one point, lost in her thoughts. During this time, despite some positives in our relationship, the challenges began to become more and more apparent. I tried to be open to compromise, but the carefree spirit we had during our engagement and early marriage was becoming increasingly difficult to recapture. My first trip to the college farm in Blackstock proved to be very productive. I worked long hours, completely immersed in my research, hardly noticing the absence of conveniences or comforts like a television. When I returned on Friday, I was eager to share my experience with Leela. I found her at Papaya Bar, where she was talking to Dennis, one of the bartenders, who was also a student. Dennis was one of the few decent people at Papaya, and I was relieved that Jared wasn't around. I sat down next to Leela and Dennis brought me a beer while I enthusiastically talked about my trip and the results I had achieved. Leela agreed to go with me on the next trip, although not very enthusiastically. I was hoping it would help us get closer again. However, our trip together to Blackstock turned out to be a disaster, largely because of me. I mistakenly believed that Leela would share my interest in research, but she did not. The small abandoned house in the middle of fields of corn and soybeans, without a working television, quickly bored her. When she interrupted me while I was working, I yelled at her sharply, which only increased her irritation. On the way back I tried to apologize. Leela, I'm very sorry that I raised my voice at you. It wasn't fair, I admitted, realizing how different our interests were. I understand if you didn't have anything to do it might seem boring. She was silent next to me, crossing her arms and looking out the window. Really boring, she finally replied dryly. I took a deep breath. Please forgive me. One of the things I've always loved about you is how different we are. You showed me a side of life that I might never have seen. I believe our differences can make us stronger. Do you really think so? She asked, and I felt a glimmer of hope that her mood had improved. Of course, Leela. More than anything in the world, I want you to be happy. I had no idea how my words would be interpreted in the coming days. The week before my next trip to Blackstock, we got along just as well as we did in the early days of our marriage. We were close, and Leela seemed much happier than she had been lately. The morning I left, she enthusiastically kissed me goodbye, and I felt like our relationship was back on track. I decided to make an effort to stay connected during the trip, trying not to get completely immersed in work. But when I called her, she didn't answer. I tried several times over the next few days, feeling increasingly upset and anxious. Finally, I called her on Friday morning. "Hello," she said, as if I had distracted her. "Are you still sleeping?" I asked in surprise. "No, I'm getting up," she muttered. I sensed something was wrong when I noticed the lack of enthusiasm. "Lila, you have morning classes. Why are you still in bed?" "I guess I'm not feeling very well," she admitted, and I couldn't suppress the anger that was starting to rise. I held back, saying I would see her when I got home. The atmosphere was tense that evening. It felt very different from the carefree moments we shared before. I offered to go to Papaya for drinks and dinner, knowing how much she usually likes the place, but she unexpectedly declined, much to my dismay. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Back at the farm in Blackstock, I called Lily again. She answered, but didn't want to talk for long. When I returned on Friday, I felt that something had changed, though I couldn't quite place what it was. I was sure Lila was happy with our marriage, but it felt like we were off track. Over the next week, I made extra efforts to rectify the situation. I was more attentive, ignored her lack of discipline in studies, brought flowers and small gifts, hoping to rekindle the love we once had. Although sometimes there were warm moments between us, they quickly disappeared. Driving home one evening, a few days before my next trip to Blackstock, I couldn't shake the thought that Lila was bored with our marriage. I spent 3 days at the farm thinking about how to get her interested, thinking back to our honeymoon in Cancun, the sun, the beaches, the fun we had. I decided that a surprise trip might be the thing to revive our relationship. On Friday morning I finished work earlier than planned and headed home from the farm full of foreboding. I rarely spend money on myself, so this surprise had to be special. However, when I got home, Lila was gone. I assumed she was probably at Papaya, so I went to the bar. As I stood in the doorway looking for her, I heard her laugh from the far end of the hall. But when I saw what was happening, I felt a chill in my chest. She was sitting on her husband's lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. I moved forward, feeling angry and confused. As I got closer, Lila turned her head and the smile instantly disappeared from her face when she saw me. "Matt, I thought you'd be back later," she said, stuttering. I turned to leave, but she rushed after me, explaining that this man, Jerome, was just an old friend of hers. My indignation reached its limit and I wrenched my hand from her grasp. At that moment, Jared appeared, his face tense. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking from her to me. "It's none of your business," I replied, trying to walk past him, but he grabbed my arm, holding me tight. "Looks like you just pushed my sister," he snapped angrily. "It's okay, Jared, it's just a misunderstanding," Lila interjected. After a brief pause, Jared finally let go of me, though there was a hint of menace in his eyes as he brushed the dust from my shoulders. "I just want to make sure my sister is okay," he said, but the tension was palpable. Reluctantly, I followed Lila upstairs, thinking about her laugh, her ease with this man, and her confrontation with Jared. I began to doubt how a married woman should behave. In the weeks that followed, our relationship seemed fragile. For the first time, I began to think that our marriage might have been a mistake. At first I thought our differences would make us stronger, but now I doubted it. Suddenly, Lila seemed more focused on saving our marriage. She became gentler and more interested in my affairs, which was a pleasant change, though I doubted her sincerity. However, I was worried about Jerome's constant presence at the bar. Our apartment was directly above his, and I often saw him outside in the smoking area, smoking those long, thin cigars. I did not know all types of tobacco, but I remembered his favorite cigars. Whenever I saw him, we didn't speak, but he always gave me the same meaningful smile that seemed almost mocking. Once I spotted him with a group of people and again he gave me the same look. I ignored it, but as soon as I passed I heard the group burst into laughter as if I was the subject of some kind of joke. Despite my love for lab work on the farm, I began to dread my trips home. My trust in Leela wavered and my imagination filled with disturbing thoughts of what might have happened while I was gone. Every Friday night, I felt mixed feelings, joy at returning home and fear of what awaited me. I returned that Friday evening to find Leela at work at Papaya and everything seemed fine. But as I climbed the stairs to our apartment, I noticed that it was cold inside. 2 windows were open, letting in cool air. At first I did not attach importance to it, closed them, but my thoughts began to develop rapidly. I was thinking about talking to my boss about changing my schedule to relieve some of the stress I was feeling during my commute. I didn't want to dwell on negative thoughts. As I unpacked, I decided to stash my travel bag under the bed, hoping that if it was out of sight, it would be out of mind. As I bent down to put her down, I noticed something strange on the other side of the bed. Curiosity made me look closer, and I found a small black cylinder and some butts nearby. At first I was puzzled, but upon closer inspection I realized that it was the stub of a fine black cigar, the same one that Jerome liked to smoke. I felt sick when I considered the possible consequences of this. It was more than likely that he was in our apartment while I was gone. Lila wrote that she would finish her shift at 8 in the evening, and we agreed to go get pizza. I tried to act like everything was fine. During dinner we talked about ordinary things, and I concealed my suspicions by talking about the events in the laboratory. However, I noticed how she increasingly lost interest in the conversation. Suddenly I asked, "Lila, why were the windows open in the apartment?" Her mood instantly changed. She looked surprised and didn't know what to say. Well, I think I was hot, so I decided to get some air," she finally answered, but her tone was as if she didn't believe what she was saying. Pretending not to notice anything suspicious, I simply nodded and calmly said, "Understood." Leela clearly relaxed after that. But I couldn't shake the guilt I saw in her eyes during that brief conversation. As we talked, thoughts of what to do next raced through my head. On Monday I took a step I never thought I would take. I called a private investigator. I was uncomfortable telling my story, but I found someone who could meet with me quickly. His name was Paul Gamble, and he looked nothing like the detectives you see on TV. Instead of a stern look, he had a friendly face, more like a friendly uncle than a hardened detective. We sat in a small cafe and I told him about my suspicions. He listened attentively, writing everything down in a notebook. "Do you think all this happens when you're on the farm?" he clarified, sipping his coffee. I nodded, feeling the anxiety begin to press even harder. "Yes, I disappear for a few days and something is definitely not right." Paul leaned back in his chair. "There are several options, how we can act. First, you can install hidden cameras in your apartment to see what is happening when you are not there. If that doesn't work, we can track her down, though it's more expensive." The idea with the cameras seemed to me the most reasonable. I didn't want to pay for long-term tracking. "Let's try the cameras," I decided. Paul nodded. "A wise choice. They are small, wireless, activated only when moving. I can install them when she's not home and then follow for a while." I told him I could find out her schedule and we agreed to install the cameras on Thursday afternoon when Leela was supposed to be at work. When Paul left I felt a mixture of nerves and sadness. I never thought that I would go so far as to watch my own wife, but I was prompted to do so by the suspicions that settled in my heart. Once Leela inspired me to live, made me feel like I could conquer the world. And now I was questioning everything about us and our relationship. Thursday came quickly. Paul came to our apartment while Leila was still working at Papaya. He worked quickly, installing cameras in the living room, kitchen and bedroom. They were so small that they perfectly blended in with their surroundings. When he finished, he explained how the system works. "I won't turn them on until next Wednesday when you go to the farm. They will record any movement after that." I thanked him, and as soon as he left, I felt a strange sense of emptiness in the apartment. It wasn't just suspicion hanging over me like a cloud, it was the realization that I might be learning something I was completely unprepared for. The next week dragged on incredibly slowly. Lila was behaving as usual, laughing, flipping through her phone, and going about her business. I carefully controlled my emotions, trying to appear calm, even though my thoughts were completely different. When Wednesday came, I packed my things for the trip to Blackstock, kissed Lila goodbye and said I'd be back on Friday. She looked amused, even hugging me tighter as I left, which made the whole situation even more confusing. The road to the farm was long and quiet, and my thoughts haunted me. I imagined those little cameras in our apartment, ready to capture anything that might happen. By Thursday night I was on edge, unable to concentrate at work. He wanted to call Paul and see if there was any news, but held back, realizing that he would have to wait until he got back. Finally, Friday came, and I drove home with an uneasy feeling. When I entered the apartment, everything seemed familiar, but I could no longer trust appearances. Paul agreed to review the tapes and meet with me over the weekend. On Sunday, I met him again in the same cafe. I was hoping for some kind of explanation, but the look on his face when I sat down at the table told me that it wasn't going to be that simple. "Matt," he began, sliding a manila envelope across the table to me, "I'm afraid the news isn't the best." My hands were shaking as I took the envelope. I hesitated before opening it. Inside were some photos taken from cameras in our living room and bedroom. They clearly showed Lila, along with Jerome. I got chills when I looked at these pictures. There was no doubt, my worst fears were confirmed. Jerome was in our apartment, sitting on my sofa, smoking his cigars, and in some pictures they were not just next to each other. The realization that he was in my bed with my wife was almost unbearable. Paul interrupted my shock with his calm voice, "I have a video too if you want to see it. But honestly, these photos are enough to give you all the information you need." I closed the envelope and took a deep breath, feeling an explosion of emotions, anger, betrayal, humiliation. Part of me wanted to go home immediately and give Lily a flight breakdown. But Paul remained calm, as if he had seen similar situations hundreds of times. "Look," he said, leaning a little closer, "I understand you're upset, but don't do anything rash. I've seen a lot of people make bad decisions at times like this. You need to think about your next steps calmly." I nodded, even though my thoughts were in chaos. I couldn't believe this was happening. Lila betrayed me and now I had to decide what to do next. "If you're thinking of a lawyer," added Paul, "I can recommend one. I worked with him before, John Scalia. He is good. If you are seriously thinking about divorce, he will help you, and with the available evidence, everything can be easier." The word divorce weighed heavily on my heart, but deep down I understood that staying married to Lila was no longer possible. I thanked Paul, paid him for his services and took the lawyer's contact. Sitting in the car, I did not move for a long time, and the envelope with photos was lying on the seat next to me, like a bomb about to explode. I thought about all those moments when I doubted myself, blamed myself for the distance between us. Now I realized that it wasn't me at all, it was her betrayal that destroyed our relationship. The next day I called John Scalia and made an appointment. The process was started and there was no going back. My marriage is over and Lila will know about it very soon. Walking home that night, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. I wasn't ready to face her yet, but I knew that moment was coming. All that remained was to gather enough courage to do what was necessary. The next morning I woke up with a strange feeling of detachment from everything around me. I did the usual things, but I felt empty in my soul. Lila was still asleep when I left the apartment early in the morning to meet with John Scalia. I didn't want to be around when she woke up, and I didn't want to pretend everything was fine. John's office was small, but looked professional and comfortable, located in a quiet part of town. When I entered, the receptionist greeted me and showed me to an office. John Scalia was an elderly man, perhaps a little over 50, with the look of a man who had seen a lot in life. His face was covered with light stubble that reminded of a difficult past. "Good morning, Matt," he said, shaking my hand tightly. "Tell me what happened." I took a deep breath and began to describe the situation, the suspicions, Jerome, the cameras, the photos, and the betrayal. John listened attentively, without interrupting, nodding occasionally as I explained everything I felt. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, hands folded under his chin. "I've dealt with cases like this before," he said, his voice even and calm. "From what you have told, and from the available evidence, this is a fairly straightforward case. You have grounds for divorce on the grounds of adultery, and that will make things a lot easier, especially in this state." I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. The idea of divorce had been swirling around in my head for several days, but hearing it clearly, from the outside, made the situation more real. There was nowhere to retreat. "That's how it's going to go," John continued. "We will submit an application for divorce to the court. You already have evidence of treason, and this will be a strong argument. As for the property, as you said, you don't have much in common, so that will make the process easier as well. You can transfer half the money from your joint accounts to a new, personal one, and we'll start from there." He paused, looking over his notes. "You will also need to decide when she will receive the documents. I can arrange delivery at any convenient time for you. It's usually better if you're not around, it helps avoid confrontation." I thought about it. I didn't want to arrange a dramatic scene with Lila. I wanted to finish everything cleanly and without unnecessary problems. "Tomorrow," I finally decided. "I will go to the farm in the morning. She will think that I will be gone for a few days. This is the best moment." John nodded. "Good. I'll see to it that the papers are delivered to her tomorrow while you're away. When it's all done, you can come back, pack your things and move on." We discussed a few more details, how long the process would take, what kind of legal fees to expect, and I left the office confused by 1,000 thoughts. I wasn't prepared for what was coming, but I couldn't avoid it. That night, back at the apartment, I tried to act like normal. Leela made dinner, something simple, and we ate in silence. I noticed that something was wrong with her too. She seemed aloof, fiddling with her phone and avoiding eye contact. Part of me wondered if she knew the end was coming, or if she could somehow sense that things were changing. After dinner we hardly spoke. I pretended to be working on papers from the farm while Leela sat in another room watching TV. The tension between us was palpable, but neither of us mentioned it. We were just waiting for something to break this silence. The next morning I left early as planned. He kissed Lila on the forehead while she was still asleep, the gesture more like a goodbye than anything else. As I drove, I felt a strange combination of sadness and relief. It was the last time I would leave this apartment as her husband. I spent the day at the farm trying to focus on research, but my mind was far away. I kept thinking about how she would react when she got the divorce papers. Will she be angry? Confused? Will she even care? Uncertainty tormented me all day. In the evening, I checked my phone, expecting to find dozens of messages from Leela. But there was nothing, no calls, no texts, just silence. Maybe she hasn't received the documents yet, or maybe she's thinking things over. In any case, I knew that soon everything would become clear. John called the next morning. "She was handed the documents," he said briefly. "No problems, no conflicts. You can come back when you're ready." I thanked him and hung up, feeling the finality of the situation begin to sink in. It was the beginning of the end. When I returned to the apartment, I immediately felt that Lila already knew everything. The atmosphere was tense and she didn't greet me as usual. I found her on the couch with the divorce papers spread out in front of her. Her face was pale and her eyes red as if she had been crying. "Matt," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "Why?" I stood in the doorway not knowing where to begin. What could I say? She knew the reason. "Because you betrayed me," I replied, my voice even but cold. You lied to me, you betrayed our trust. I can't live like this anymore. Lila's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I thought she was going to apologize, beg for forgiveness. But instead she just shook her head, her face contorted with emotion. I never wanted this to happen, she whispered. Everything got out of control. A wave of anger rose in me. Didn't you want this to happen? You brought him to our house, Lila. In our bed. Tears were already flowing freely down her face, but I felt no pity. Couldn't. Everything that was between us broke into small pieces. I'm so sorry, Matt, she sobbed. I know I messed everything up. I don't know what to say. I stood trying to take it all in. The woman I once loved, whom I married, was now a stranger to me. I couldn't forgive her even if I wanted to. It's over, I finally said, my voice firm. I'm done. You can stay here for now, but I will be moving. Everything else will be decided by the lawyers. Lila nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. She did not argue, did not try to fight. She probably knew it was useless. Without saying another word, I went to the bedroom to collect my things. It didn't take long, some clothes, some personal belongings, documents. When I moved around the apartment, I realized how little I was here. Most of the things belonged to her, decor, furniture, memories. None of it felt like mine anymore. When I finished, I looked around one last time. Lila was still sitting on the couch, staring at the floor. I didn't say, sorry. There was no need for this. We both knew it was over. I closed the door behind me, and for the first time in a long time I felt a sense of freedom returning. The following weeks flew by in a whirlwind of paperwork, legal meetings, and emotional turmoil. The divorce went quickly thanks to evidence of infidelity, and a few months later everything was officially finalized. Lila and I have hardly spoken since our last conversation. All issues were resolved by our lawyers, and when the process was over, we went our separate ways. I completely immersed myself in work, using the farm as an outlet to distract myself from the pain of a failed marriage. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the feeling of betrayal stayed with me. Lies, lost trust, all this continued to eat away at me from the inside. However, over time I began to heal. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild my life, focusing on the future instead of the past. I moved to a small apartment located closer to the farm, and gradually the memories of Lila began to fade into the background. But sometimes I found myself thinking about her, trying to understand how things could have changed so much. And each time I reminded myself of one simple truth: sometimes the deepest pain comes from those closest to you, and the strength to move on is always within us. Over time, I learned to let go of the past. Days turned into weeks, and my new life gradually took shape. My small apartment, tucked away in a quiet part of the city, became a refuge for me. It was a modest space, just the bare essentials, but it was mine, and it gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Working on the farm kept me busy, which was exactly what I needed. Physical work became a great distraction that helped me tire my body by the end of each day and not think about the painful. Lila receded more and more into the past, and her presence in my life remained only in random, fleeting memories. Now, when I thought of her, it wasn't with anger or resentment, just a certain indifference. I built a wall around these memories, keeping them at a distance, knowing that opening old wounds would only bring new pain. The divorce officially ended our life together, but the real healing came from the moment I accepted the fact that what was between us was irreparable. As I settled into my new routine, I realized that rebuilding my life wasn't just about getting over the pain, it was about finding myself again. For many years, myself was attached to the role of husband, breadwinner, partner. Now I had to figure out who I was outside of these roles. I started reconnecting with old friends that I hardly saw during my marriage to Lila. I didn't realize how far I had drifted away from them, engrossed in marriage and its complexities. Now that the burden of that relationship was gone, I started reaching out again. At first it was not easy, awkward pauses, questions about what happened. But gradually I again felt that I belonged to something bigger. One evening, after a long day on the farm, I was sitting in my apartment with a cold beer in hand and I realized something important. For the first time in a long time I felt normal. I wasn't happy yet, not really, but I wasn't drowning in grief. I found myself somewhere in the middle, learning to live between the past and the future. And at that moment it was enough. Months passed, and with each one I became a little stronger. I continued to work on the farm, putting my energy into research and helping with various projects. Being alone was good for me, it gave me time to think about everything that had happened and start to imagine what my future could be. One day, as I was finishing work in the field, I got a call from an old friend, Tim. We have recently reconnected and have met a few times for drinks and reminiscing about old times. Tim knew about my divorce and listened to me more than once, not imposing advice, but supporting. "Hello, my friend," his voice was calm, but I could hear a note of admiration in it. "I have something interesting for you." "What happened?" I asked curiously. "There's a new construction project and they need someone to do land use management, soil testing, environmental impact assessment, things like that. It's right behind your profile, so I thought you might be interested." I considered the offer for a moment. It's been a while since I've thought about a career change, but this idea intrigued me. Managing such a large project could be a good way to step out of your comfort zone. "Sounds interesting," I said, feeling a little excited. "I got the details, I'll look them over." Tim talked about the project, a large-scale development outside the city limits that could change the entire area. It was a serious chance, and I could not hide my interest in challenging myself with something new and ambitious. I thought about that possibility as I lay in bed that night. Lately, I've been focused on just getting through the day, trying to survive. But maybe it's time to think about something more than just survival. Maybe it's time to start rebuilding not only your life, but also your career, your future. The project seemed like a step in that direction, a chance to apply all my experience, all that I've been through, and turn it into something productive, something meaningful. The next morning I called Tim. "I agree," I said firmly. "Let's try." The following weeks flew by in a series of meetings, planning and visits to the facility. The project was huge, much bigger than anything I had done before, and required full concentration. It was exactly what I needed, not just an escape from the past, but an opportunity to create something real, something concrete. After immersing myself in work, I began to feel more confident, having a clearer understanding of who I am and where I am going. The pain of the past still lingered in the background, but it no longer controlled me. I moved forward, one step at a time, toward a future I could be proud of. One evening, after a particularly busy day at the site, I was driving home and the setting sun was casting a warm light over the fields. On the way, I thought about everything I'd been through, betrayals, heartbreaks, divorces, and how far I'd come since then. Life had a habit of throwing up surprises, but somehow I managed to get through all these difficulties. When I got home, I left the car in the parking lot and sat for a while, looking at the evening sky. A sense of peace washed over me, and for the first time in a long time, I knew I was ready to move on. To really move on. The past will always be a part of me, but it no longer defines me. I had weathered the storm and was now ready to rebuild my life, on my own terms, without the shadow of betrayal hanging over me. As I got out of the car and walked to the apartment, I felt a quiet sense of victory. It was not a great victory, not the kind that movies or books are written about. But it was my victory. And this, I realized, was more than enough. After all, life doesn't revolve around those who betrayed you or the pain they caused. Life is about finding the strength to move forward, build further, no matter what. And that's exactly what I was going to do. A few years later. Looking back, it's amazing to realize how much my life has changed compared to what it was before. After the project with Tim, new opportunities arose and I eventually started my own consulting business, dealing with large developments around the country. It was hard work, but it was satisfying and gave me a sense of purpose that I had been missing for a long time. As for love, it took longer. After everything that happened with Leela, I was in no rush to jump into a relationship again. I needed time to understand who I was, to fully heal before I could even consider letting someone new into my life. But over time, I met a person, a woman who was kind, patient and understanding of everything I went through. We took our time, and for the first time I felt like I could trust again. Now we are married, and life surprises you when you least expect it. We built a home together, created a family, and every day I wake up with gratitude for this second chance. If you had asked me, when I was drowning in betrayal and despair, if I could ever be happy again, I would have said no. But here I am, living proof that life goes on, and that no matter how deep the pain, there's always a way forward. How strange and incomprehensible this world is. The deepest pain is caused by those who are closest, and help comes from those from whom you least expect it. It's a lesson I've learned the hard way, but it's also one that's made me stronger. And now, as I sit watching my kids play in the yard and my wife laugh next to me, I can finally say with confidence that I've been through it all. And it turns out that life can be beautiful. Years passed, and as I continued to reflect on my path, I realized how much I had changed not only as a person, but also as a person who learned to accept unexpected turns in life. My consulting business has succeeded far beyond my expectations. The work brought me the satisfaction and stability that I always sought. But most of all, she gave me the freedom to focus on what was most important, my family, happiness, and the future I was building. My new wife, Lauren, was everything I didn't know I needed. Unlike Leela, there were no ulterior motives, no games in her. We met at a mutual friend's party, and something about her calm, gentle nature immediately attracted me. It wasn't a stormy romance like before, it was something stable, warm and honest. A love that felt like a solid foundation, not something that could crumble under pressure. We were in no hurry to get closer. After what I'd been through, I didn't want to rush things, and she understood that. Lauren had her disappointments too, not as dramatic as mine, but she knew what it was to pick up the pieces of a life that didn't go as planned. This understanding created a bond between us that seemed unbreakable. When we finally got married, it was no big deal. Everything was simple and intimate, with only the closest relatives and friends at a small winery. The setting sun illuminated the vineyards in golden light as we exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other in a way we had never known before. Our life together was quiet and peaceful, but that was the beauty of it. We have created a home that has become a haven for us, a place where love is real, where rooms are filled with laughter, and where trust is the foundation of everything we do. We had 2 children, a son and a daughter, and every day I am surprised that I had the opportunity to start all over again, to experience the joy of parenthood, which I had not even imagined before. My children are my pride and joy. Watching them grow up, teaching them new things, seeing their enthusiasm for even the simplest things is a happiness I never thought I would be able to experience again. They remind me that life can offer new beginnings, no matter how dark some moments may seem. When I play with them in the yard and hear their laughter fill the air, I feel an incredible sense of gratitude. I have a family that I love and a life that promises only the best. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I think about the past, not with bitterness, but with a sense of peace. I think of Leela, the mistakes we both made, and the pain I once felt. I used to wonder why everything happened the way it did, why betrayal had to become a part of my story. But now I look at it differently. That betrayal, as painful as it was, led me to where I am now. She taught me important lessons about resilience, self-worth, and the importance of being around someone who truly values you. If it wasn't for this time in my life, I wouldn't have met Allison. I would not have the family that I value so much now. In a way, I'm even grateful for those trials, not for the pain, but for the growth that came after it. One day, While working in the yard, my son, Jacob, ran up to me with something in his hand. "Daddy! Look what I found," he exclaimed, clutching tightly in his hand a crumpled leaf that caught his attention. I smiled, knelt down to his level and said, "That's a really nice piece of paper, my friend," marveling at his fascination with the little thing. He looked up at me with his innocent childish eyes, and in that moment I realized how far I had come. From that broken man who was once betrayed, to the father who now has everything he once only dreamed of. Allison joined us, carrying our daughter, Mia, in her arms. She watched as Jacob showed me his treasure, her gaze filled with warmth and love. This was my life now, a life filled with joy, connection, and peace. Standing there with them, I couldn't help but think about how incomprehensible life is. It turns out in ways you never expected, and the people you thought were closest to you may end up being the ones who hurt you the most. But despite all this, despite all the pain and disappointment, the world keeps turning. You find your way, even when it seems impossible. And in those quiet moments, when the past becomes a distant memory and the future seems limitless, you realize that your deepest pain doesn't have to define you. These are the hands that supported you, second chances and unexpected love that show what life really means. I realize that no matter how dark the times, there is always light waiting to break through. And for me, this light came in the form of a new life, a new family and a love that I finally realized was worth all those trials. Because in the end, it's not the pain that shapes you, it's how you manage to overcome it that matters. And I got up.